everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 94 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, we're going to drop straight bars. We're going to talk about FAI, femoracetabular impingement. How does that form? I'll give you the answer. We're going to talk about warm-ups. Is it worthwhile to change someone's prep routine? Why would you impact someone's warm-up? What is the warm-up good for? I'll give you the answer. And last but not least, we're going to talk about EMG studies. Is there useful information that we can take from these studies and implement into our practice? These have been questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here, fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from my dude, the legend himself, Tim. Here's what Tim asks me. Topic for a debrief. Femoracetabular impingement, FAI, and elaborating on the concept of bones don't touch. I.e., if bones don't touch, how is extra bone being built around the femur and acetabulum? How would that not be a runaway process cycle? Tim, great question. So, how is bone built? That's the first thing that we have to ask. And bone is built based on Wolff's Law. Not too many laws in science, so this is kind of a big deal. Wolff's Law states, this is according to Wikipedia, so, take it for whatever it's worth, but it's a freaking law, man. Wolff's Law states that bone in a healthy person or animal will adapt to the loads under which it's placed. So if we relate that to FAI, if there's alterations in the bone, whether it's a cam lesion, which is a change to, check out this new pelvis I got, a change to the femoral head, or if it's a pincer lesion, which is a change to the acetabulum, that gets there because there is increased load in that area and the body lays down extra bone to accommodate said load. Now, Tim mentions that I said something along the lines of, well, bones don't touch. This is something that's found in the research. I will link a study in the show notes that talks about this. And also, if you want to learn a little bit more about a potential mechanism as to why, I would definitely check out the book, The Fourth Phase of Water. I'll link that in the show notes as well, which will be found on zachcouples.com either today or tomorrow. The study I'm going to be talking about, basically what they did in this study was, it was a case study, so n equals 1, whatever. But this physician, who's also a biomechanist, or a biomechanist, he was put under local anesthesia and had his MD buddy scope his knee. And he took his knee into deep knee flexion, and he also simulated weight bearing by pushing into his buddy, all under local anesthesia. And despite the best efforts of both of those practitioners, they could not get the bones to approximate. There was always space between those bones. So that reasons us to believe that perhaps bones do not touch in the joint surfaces. I think this is the case, based on some of the research done in Fourth Phase of Water, as well as some of the research done on synovial fluid, among other things. Generally, the thicker the fluid, the better the lubrication is along those surfaces. So, yeah, for those factors, I'm a believer that bones likely do not touch within the joint capsule, assuming that we have a healthy bone. Now, if you have a situation where you've had degradation of the cartilage, that may impact things and may lead to some bony contact. So, how is extra bone being built if they don't touch? Well, Tim, let's think of other places where bones don't touch that we don't even have to, let's say you don't buy that, but I think you should buy that. But let's say you don't. Consider the spine as a prime example of that. If you perform axial loading to the spine, you will get increases in bone growth to the vertebrae. The vertebrae do not touch. They have discs between each of them. So how can bones grow in cases of axial loading, or hopefully in cases where we have someone who's osteoporotic, where bone growth is slowed by training. How does bone grow in that case? So that's one prime example of a place where you can have bone growth, but not necessarily bones touching. How would then that apply to the case of FAI? Well, if there's increased loading in areas where the increased bone is formed, and which leads to a potential impingement, then what's likely going on is certain areas of the bone, whether it's the acetabular component or the femoral component, are getting increased loading that is different than the surrounding area. How could that happen? Perhaps, just a theory, perhaps the reason why there's increased loading in certain areas of the bone is because of a loss of movement options. And so then, if I'm constantly loading this certain area over and over and over again, and I never get a chance to offload it, then you have Wolff's Law doing its job, which is increasing the bone growth to accommodate the increased loading in that area. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, what you going to do about it? I'm glad you asked, selves. What I think you could do then is, if there was a way to improve the movement options in that area, increase joint range of motion, develop better skills at various movements, #movement variability, what you going to do about it, then I would think that could alter the loading that's occurring at the hip joint, and you ought to be in business. And most of the people, when they get the pinching or anything like that in FAI, it's at their relative end range. What happens if you increase that end range? Perhaps then you have a scenario where you no longer are stressing some of those areas, there's not increased loading where the extra bone is being laid down, and perhaps you could slow the formation of something such as FAI. And that's my thought process behind that. If you want to learn how to improve hip range of motion, man, there's a gang of debriefs you can go into on that. I'll link those debriefs in the show notes as well. To summarize your question, though, Tim, bones don't touch, in my opinion, based on some of the research that we look at, which is linked, and some of the stuff that Pollack talks about in the fourth phase of water. So if they don't touch, how is increased bone laid down? Wolff's Law. If there's increased loading on any structure, that structure is going to grow. Loading can come from a loss of movement options, and then certain areas are targeted by increasing bone growth. Your solution then to improve something such as FAI would be to improve the movement options in the area so the loading occurs more evenly along the bones. And if you do that, you ought to be in business. Tim, great question. The next question comes from my dude, the legend himself, Kyle Dobbs. Kyle's a dear friend of mine. He's got a great interview, like the man when it comes to psychology's role in personality, in business, and training. Definitely I'll link that interview in the show notes. But here's what Kyle asks. Thoughts on the return on investment and potential pitfalls of changing someone's prep routine, i.e. familiarity, belief versus novelty, efficiency, and reasons why you would make those changes, such as pain, progression, etc. So, great question, Kyle. Michelle, a.k.a. Coach Bo, wrote a great post on my site. If you don't know who that is, shame on you. I'll link her in the show notes. But she wrote a post recently on warming up, and I think it's one of the best laid out posts on warm-up I've seen. I'm slightly biased because it was put on my site. But what does a warm-up do? A warm-up, I think, and I would agree with Michelle on this, is useful to teach certain skills at a low intensity. For example, if you're working on the quality of improving someone's hip extension, you may choose low-level drills to focus on that. It's also useful to teach teach positions to get your body into that will prepare the tissues for the task at hand. So if you're doing squats on that day, you may want to do activities that prepare you from the squat, both putting your body into positions that would be useful in a squat, as well as loading up the tissues in a manner, warming up the tissues so they can tolerate that activity. So, in my opinion, I think that that's useful from a warm-up perspective, if we're talking training and the gym and all that, to choose or vary the warm-up as much as possible so it supports the skills that you're going to be practicing within the session. Now here's a question. What about something like competition? That would be another question. Is it worthwhile to change someone's prep routine? Well, if you have a situation where that individual is superstitious, or there's certain things that they like to do in order to perform at a high level, it may be not worthwhile introducing something new in that case, unless you potentially have better drills that could better prepare that individual to perform whatever the task is at hand. So for basketball, maybe that's doing some jumping or some particular dynamic stretches or whatever. I think that does have some use, but changing things such as changing the music that they're listening to or stuff like that, I don't think that that's useful. And also, too, I think pre-competition is probably not worth introducing a new skill for that person to learn. You want to make sure that they are prepared both physically and mentally to perform the sport that they're trying to do. So the warm-up in that case is not necessarily the time for learning. It's the time for doing whatever it takes to get that individual to perform at a high level. So that could involve changing the dynamic warm-up, but maybe early in the season. So they're not, because having worked in pro sports personally, some players they got to do certain things in a certain order when they're going to go out there and perform. But I think too, if you have a situation where the warm up is maybe, or their prep routine is not conducive to them performing well on the floor, and you got something better, it's just a conversation you have with an athlete. When I was in the NBA, I entered in the beginning, or not in the beginning, but like midway through the season. So it's a really tough time to knock guys out of their routines. But if I, in the training arena or in the gym floor, was able to help them through some changes or improve some movement quality or make them feel better, and they see that there's utility in that, a lot of guys aren't opposed to changing the warm-up if they think that's going to help them. So while I don't think that it's necessarily going to, I don't think there's anything we're going to do that's going to negatively impact the performance, unless there's, like I said, changing music or certain superstitious rituals that they have beforehand. Many of these guys were convinced that some of the stuff that I offered was useful to them, and they would do that before warm-up, and I think that's totally cool. And also, too, I would work with guys if there was a timeout or if they were on the bench and they needed something to get loosened up. There's things that we could do for that helped them, and that was also quite useful. So I think that as long as you're not trying to teach them a new task pre-game, it's probably okay to change the prep routine. But I think you want to do so at a time where it's maybe early in the season, or you're just changing one aspect or whatever. And I don't think you have to do a complete overhaul, because really a lot of this, I think we can't underestimate the value of psychological preparation in that regard. So to summarize your question, Kyle, changing someone's prep routine, totally worthwhile in the training room and in the weight room. We're using this stuff to prepare the tissues to perform the task at hand, as well as teach new skills. If we're talking competition, we still want to prepare the tissues, but we're not necessarily teaching new skills. So is it worthwhile to change it? We have to ask ourselves, is the athlete's current warm-up preparing the tissues to be able to perform the task at hand effectively? If that's not the case, then it's probably worthwhile to have a conversation with that athlete to say, hey, these activities might be better suited to help you do whatever you got to do to play whatever sport it is. And in my experience, most guys are pretty cool with that if they need to do that, especially if you've made some substantial changes with them on the training room or in the weight room. Are you going to change things like what music they listen to or some of the superstitions they may have? Probably not worthwhile, and it's probably not going to be that deleterious to them performing their craft at a high level. Kyle, great question. Before I get into this last question, if you're wondering, well, Zach, what are some like good activities that we could start introducing into a warm-up? Or, Zach, you talked about helping someone with FAI and improving movement options in the hip. Well, how do we do that? There's an answer for you, and the answer is at Human Matrix, my seminal seminar. And we just had one this last weekend, and what turned out to be a really good one. I like where it's at. We did all types of wild and crazy things. We taught the people who attended to establish a movement baseline by utilizing a test-retest system and being able to apply that baseline under load. So if you want to do that, there's 4 opportunities upcoming, and I'd love to see you at one of them. You can find me at October 5th and 6th in Boston, Massachusetts, November 23rd and 24th in New York City, December 7th and 8th in Orlando, Florida, and first one in 2020, January 25th, 26th in Scotts Valley, California, which is in the Bay Area. It is near Santa Cruz, so you should definitely check me out. Also, on the website, I just released a monster post on Monday. You should definitely check out. I'll link it in the show notes. But we did a review of the Ben House's Beginner's Mind Retreat. Lots of good speakers there. Ben House, Pat Davidson, Brian Walsh, Lucy Hendricks, Mike T. Nelson, Seth Oberst, Ryan LeCure, and then myself, but I don't talk about myself. I hope I hit everyone. So it was great. Great place. If you haven't got a chance to check out Ben's spot, you should definitely do so. I'll link that in the show notes as well. I'm going to try my darndest to go to his thing next year. It's in March, so it's a worthwhile experience on many levels. That post has a bit more information on it. The last question comes from Anthony. Here's what Anthony asks me. Yo, Big Z, how much stock do we put into EMG studies? Love your work. Anthony, thank you so much. EMG studies, what is EMG? Electromyography. Basically what you do is you are measuring muscle activity by either sticking surface electrodes over a specific area or you're sticking a needle into that area and you see, hey, is this stuff working? Is it not? That's EMG. What's my stance on it? If we're looking at EMG studies, it depends on why you're looking at EMG studies. For example, I think a useful use of EMG studies is in regards to muscular hypertrophy. These things measure maximal or the percentage of activity of a given muscle group. That could potentially be beneficial from a hypertrophy perspective. I want to increase loading as much as possible in my biceps. So what I may do is I might perform EMG study on the biceps through various activities and see which moves are the best for that given person. And to me, I think EMG is probably useful in that regard. In all other cases, I don't really see that it's that useful. And here's why. First off, I've heard Charlie Weingraf speak upon this, who I'll link him in the show notes, and he provided some very useful things to say about EMG. Muscle activity is necessarily a good or bad thing. For example, if I'm raising my arm overhead, I may not want 100% EMG activity of the supraspinatus. I might need just enough to be able to do that successfully. And we could argue the same thing with weighted activities or in sport. So it's not about how much something can contract. The tissues just need to contract enough to be able to maximize force production while minimizing risk of injury. And if your exercise is not doing that, it's probably going to be not a desirable move. So if EMG is only looking at the amount of activity and we're not taking into consideration what is the best amount for a given movement, then it's probably not worthwhile in that regard. Also, I think that EMG, when we're discussing pain or specific muscles firing at certain times, I think that that's incredibly unuseful. And I'll give a shout out to Bill Hartman on this one. But a lot of times researchers will measure specific areas that they think are relevant to a given task. A prime example of that was Paul Hodges in the beginning when he measured how transverse abdominis change from in terms of timing and muscle activity in regards to low back pain individuals versus those without low back pain. Well, when you only look at the transversus abdominis, you're ignoring all of the other potential changes that could occur in the body when someone is exhibiting a pain experience. And to me, that is very myopic, which research has to be to a degree, but I think you're missing out a lot if we're just looking at muscle activity and timing via EMG when it comes to pain. Moreover, if we compare surface EMG versus fine wire EMG, surface can be very muddy because you can't necessarily get any specificity out of it. Fine wire you can. But we would run into the same problems that we discussed before, namely muscle activity doesn't tell you the whole story, nor does looking at only specific muscles when we're talking about making decisions based off of EMG. So to me, from a hypertrophy perspective, I think EMG is useful, but for everything else, probably not. I don't base too many decisions off of EMG unless hypertrophy is the goal. And if you are going to use EMG, your best bet is to probably go more for fine wire than you are for surface. Great question, Anthony, and I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. If you want to learn more, go to zachcouples.com, subscribe to my newsletter. There's 5 hours of talks, a free acute to chronic workload calculator, and you'll get goodies every Friday in terms of what's new and hip on the interwebs. While you're there, you may also want to check out the 3 services I offer. Movement consultations, which if you're a trainer and you're struggling getting your client moving the way you want to, and you need better eyes, or maybe you're toyed and you're not moving as well as you'd like to, I can help you through that. We'll go through an evaluation together. We'll figure out what movements you need to improve your movement repertoire, get you in business. We can also do that from a fitness perspective, because I can take that same movement consultation and apply it to a training program. And that's very useful, whether you're post-rehab, whether you're a trainer and you need a coach, I can offer an online training for you as well. Or maybe you just want to learn how to do that with your people, because I can say all these things, but you're probably wondering how does it apply to my population. That's where the mentorship program comes in. With that, we will do some back and forth dialogue. I will go through and teach. You will ask questions. I will ask you questions to answer those questions, and we will help take this information and apply it in the best manner for your people to help them reach their goals. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, you'll want to find me on iTunes and Stitcher. Search The Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There are 93 other debriefs. And, some of the earlier ones, I was like a little scared to do the debriefs. I'm a little bit more chill, so maybe you just want to do the audio side of those. If you do so, go to iTunes and leave a review so we can help the fam grow. Social media-wise, I'm on Facebook /ZCouples. The Twitter handle, same thing, Z Couples. The Instagram, baby, is Zach, ZAC Couples, CUPPLES. And I'm also on YouTube if you search Zach Couples. If you want to see what exercises and activities I'm applying with my clientele currently, that thing is constantly updated. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. And keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.